and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're answering a question from Brandon. Brandon, listener of the show, who said hello. Would love to hear about your thoughts on the LVR restrictions coming back, and if so, when do you see that actually happening? And look, this is a very good question, Brandon, because there's a lot in the media about this. We're probably about 6 months since the Reserve Bank lifted those LVR restrictions, which meant that we, as investors, could borrow more money from the bank against houses if we're looking at existing houses. And there's a lot in the media saying, are they going to come back? So, Andrew, I want to get your thoughts on this, but just give us a recap. Why did the LVRs get taken off on the 1st of May this year?
Sure. So originally they got, going back a bit further, they got brought in because we wanted to, we didn't, the Reserve Bank wanted to slow down investors and also, I guess, people buying their own house to make sure that they had a sizable deposit, which in essence means that you can borrow less than you could if there wasn't the restrictions in place. And previously you could borrow 95% on an owner-occupied property any day of the week, and you could borrow 80% on a bad day with a rental property, 90% back when I was lending a long time ago, and you used to be able to go 95 on your first property, then 90 on your first rental, and then I think it dropped to 80, and then your next one was 70. Those were the good old days. But now of course, it's 80% deposit is the baseline for an owner-occupier if you're not a first-home buyer, and you're going to live in this property, obviously, owner-occupier. And then it was came in at 60% for an investor, meaning you need a 40% deposit, which really did slow things down. Now they took away these restrictions, and we'd got to 70% for an investor at time of COVID. When we came out of lockdown, they announced that they were going to remove the restrictions for a year. Now, whether or not it goes for a year, and actually Ed's made a note here that the date of the review is the end of April. Now, is that certain, or can they review it at any time? Because my understanding was it could be reviewed any time, and I actually wonder whether or not they will review it earlier.
Thank you for reading my notes, first of all, Andrew. But so they're probably going to announce what they're going to do November, December this year. So I'd expect them to be making that decision probably nowish over the next few months, announcing it. And then if they are going to bring them back in, that it would be at the time that they'd said. Generally speaking, the Reserve Bank's pretty good at sticking to what it said it's going to do. So
yeah, correct. But there is a bit of pressure at the moment, and the housing market is hot. Everyone is feeling some heat in the housing market across the country at the moment, which is great. I mean, that's why they took them. That's why they took them away, because the Reserve Bank, I think Adrian Orr is quoted here saying they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at it, and they kind of need to, because when we were in COVID lockdown, number one, we didn't know what it was going to look like on the other side. And it was quite nerve-wracking for a lot of people thinking, is the housing market going to, the arse going to fall out of it? Because if it did, that really affects people's spending habits. It's an interesting thing that the secret political thing that we never talk about is that we want people to feel rich. We want their houses to go up in value, because if they feel rich because their house is going up in value, they spend money, and that improves inflation.
Now, what I want to say as well is, what's the impact potentially been of the LVR restrictions being removed? Of course, so many things have happened all at once, and the LVR restriction removal is only one part of the equation. But look, since the 1st of May, when those restrictions came off, the median house price in New Zealand has risen $65,000. It's increased from $620K to $685K. Now, of course, it's not necessarily the best metric, because lots of things are happening, and it's a bit of a volatile metric, which we've spoken about, but it's a very good indication of what we all anecdotally know, which is the fact that the housing market is quite heated at the moment. But what I want to talk about is, if these LVR restrictions came back, would it have an impact? Would it have a sizable impact stopping house prices increasing? And I just want to talk about what happened last time. So there was a 6.5-year period where some form of LVR restrictions were in, and that's between October 2013 and, as we all know, May 2020. Well, over that time, that 6.5 years, house prices rose, on average, 6.69% per year, and that's compounding. So the median house price in New Zealand rose from $407,000 to $620,000.
That's during that time frame.
Now, we don't know what would have happened if those restrictions weren't in place. We can't go back and rewrite history. But what we know is that you can still have sizable house price inflation with investors still operating in the market, even with some form of LVR restriction in place. And that's because there's still going to be a whole heap of homeowners out there with equity, because house prices have risen, that they can then use a portion of to go and become property investors or to grow a portfolio.
And it's interesting. I think often the media are to blame with kind of putting out what's causing the housing market to go bananas. And often it is investors, these big bad investors that snap up all the properties and keep poor first home buyers back in there, in I was going to say in the streets, but actually in their house renting them. But the reality is also the overseas investors, boy, they used to get such a hard time in terms of, they were buying up all our properties and it was causing the market to go berserk. But after the introduction of the Overseas Investment Act, which prohibits most overseas investors buying here, well, the market's still going crazy. So actually, a lot of the time, just some of these headlines aren't actually the truth. If you ask me, the number one thing that affects the housing market is the inability for developers to produce new stock quickly enough. And that's not because they can't build them quickly, because I see buildings go up all the time. It's because of all the red tape that goes with actually getting something consented and then getting it signed off at the end.
Now, there was a very interesting article in Stuff written by friend of the show, Tony Alexander, with the headline, "Here's why neither first home buyers nor investors are to blame for higher house prices." Now, this is actually in a response to what I think it was the president of the New Zealand Property Investors Federation came out and said, saying that first home buyers, quite foolishly, she came out and said first home buyers were one of the reasons that house prices were going up, which she really got a bit of shtick for from the media. Did you not see that?
No, I didn't see that.
I'll have to show you. It was quite good, actually. There were some good memes around it.
It's only one of the reasons, but okay.
Well,
but we would never say that. Send your complaints to her.
The main reasoning and the main line of thinking that Tony's gone for is that a big thing driving higher house prices is people's expectations of future house prices. So if you really think that house prices are going to be higher in the future than they are today, then you're going to be willing to bid a little bit more on that house. You're going to be more willing to be active in the market and to take action now, because if they're going to be more expensive in the future than they are now, then I've got to get in today. And the things that are driving, or some of the factors that are driving this expectation, are things like, hey, we've handled COVID pretty well in New Zealand. We expect more people to move back here. We've got very, very low interest rates. We expect that will create higher demand in the future. And so because everybody, both first home buyers, investors, any home purchasers or property purchasers expect house prices to be higher in the future, that is one thing driving it up. So it's not just LVRs. And putting these LVR restrictions in is not going to slow down the housing market to a massive degree.
Absolutely.
Now I've got two more examples I just want to walk through, because it will have an impact, having said that, at the margin. So let's say that you've got a $500,000 property and you've got a mortgage of $200K in that. So you've owned it for a little while, you've paid down your mortgage. So based on that, your $500K personal home that you own and your $200K mortgage, you've got $200,000 of usable equity in there you can go and purchase property with. Now, if you take that as your deposit and purchase an investment property without LVR, so you have a 20% deposit, you can purchase $1 million worth of property. If these restrictions come back in, and now you've got to have a 30% deposit to purchase an existing rental property, then that means you're only going to be able to purchase up to $667,000. So there's a difference of about $333K in there. So you're going to have significantly less purchasing power if you're tighter on equity, if you've got less equity. And actually the funny thing is, in this case, it's going to mean that people who have a lot of equity, people who are relatively more wealthy, will still be able to access the housing market. But the people who don't have as much equity but want to grow it through property investment investment are going to be the ones inhibited in doing so.
Yes, and actually that's the interesting thing. Often these restrictions that they bring in place, such as LVR restrictions or ring fencing of losses, they actually affect middle New Zealand much more than it affect the serious property investors. If you're mum and dad and you're buying one rental property, you probably need that tax rebate to kind of make it achievable for you, or you did previously. Now that that's been taken away, those are the people who are affected, whereas someone like myself, where you might have some properties making a profit, some making a loss, they offset each other, so it doesn't actually matter. So it doesn't slow down that type of investor. But to answer the question, I do think they will come back, and at the very latest, I think that will be the review date. I actually was wondering whether or not they might make this change sooner. And certainly investors that I've been talking to around structuring their debt at the moment, I'll be talking to them about whether or not split bank is appropriate, because one of the investors I'm working with, I think they need to get their split banking done now, because if they do bring it in, or at least even just announce that it's coming back in, banks might suddenly say, okay, yes, we're still allowed to do this higher LVR, but we're not going to, because we know next year our book's going to be assessed again.
Exactly. I similarly believe that there probably will be something come in, not because it's going to have a major impact on the housing market, because I think of the optics of it will probably require that from a political standpoint. Yes. And look, we do know that Adrian Orr is considering and thinking about how the policies he's introducing is impacting the price of assets and the asset inflation, which is causing people who own things, who own capital, to become relatively more wealthy. The one interesting unintended consequence, and I know we love to talk about unintended consequences on the show, is it's actually going to make renovation significantly harder, because the LVR restrictions primarily affect existing properties, and that's going to mean people who want to do renovations require more equity, because of course you've got to fund the house purchase, and then you also need to fund the renovations out of your equity. And the thing is that when you make renovations harder, you've got older housing stock on the market. And so you've got a few more properties out in the housing stock that are not up to scratch for people to live in. And so I think that's one of the interesting unintended consequences, that you're going to have fewer properties that are brought up to a livable standard, because it makes it harder for people to renovate them. Hey, look, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you've got a question like Brandon, send us a text. Our number is 5522. And if you send us a text with a topic idea, or just have a chat, or to let us know how you're finding the show, we'll message you back. We really enjoy chatting back and forth with you, and it's a great way to make this a two-way conversation. So give us a text, whip out your phone, 5522. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
I'm Adrian Orr.
I'm going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.